The lecture hall at Seoul National University fell into hushed silence as Professor Park Ji-hoon entered, his footsteps echoing against the polished floors like a metronome marking time. At 32, he was the youngest professor in the literature department, a fact that both impressed and intimidated his students in equal measure. His reputation preceded him, brilliant, demanding, and utterly dedicated to his craft as both an educator and a novelist. But today, as he arranged his notes at the podium and looked out at the sea of expectant faces, his eyes found her again. Third row, slightly to the left, always in the same seat as if it were reserved specifically for her quiet presence. Han, so young, sat with perfect posture, her notebook already open, pen poised with an eagerness that never failed to stir something unexpected in his chest. Today, we'll be discussing the concept of inspiration in modern Korean literature, Ji-hoon began, his voice carrying the authority that commanded attention from even the most distracted students. How do writers find their muse? What transforms ordinary observation into extraordinary art? As he spoke, his gaze inevitably drifted back to So Young. She was taking notes with the same meticulous care she brought to everything, her brow slightly furrowed in concentration. There was something about the way she listened, not just hearing his words, but absorbing them, processing them, making them part of herself, that had captivated him from the very first day of the semester. So Young felt the weight of his attention and looked up, their eyes meeting for a brief moment that sent electricity through her entire being. She quickly looked down at her notes, her cheeks warming with a blush she hoped wasn't visible from the front of the lecture hall. Professor Park had this way of making every student feel like they were the only one in the room when he looked at them. But lately, she'd begun to wonder if the intensity of his gaze meant something more when it landed on her. "Miss Han," Ji-hoon said suddenly, and So Young's heart stopped. "What do you think drives a writer to create? What is that spark that transforms silence into story?" So Young stood slowly, aware that every eye in the lecture hall was now on her. This was a dance they'd performed many times over the past 3 months. He would ask her questions that seemed to probe deeper than mere academic inquiry, and she would answer with insights that surprised even herself. "I think," she began, her voice gaining strength as she found her footing, "that writers create because they see something in the world that others might miss. Maybe it's the way morning light falls across someone's face, or the particular sadness in a stranger's smile, or the way two people can be in the same room but exist in completely different universes. The muse isn't always a person. Sometimes it's a moment, a feeling, a truth that demands to be captured before it disappears forever." The silence that followed her answer was different from the usual classroom quiet. It was charged, electric, as if she had unknowingly voiced something profound that resonated through the very air between them. Ji-hoon felt his breath catch. In 3 months of teaching her, So Young had consistently demonstrated an understanding of literature that went beyond academic analysis. She felt it, lived it, breathed meaning into words in a way that reminded him why he'd fallen in love with writing in the first place. "Beautifully put," he said, his voice softer than usual. That kind of observation, that ability to see the extraordinary in the ordinary, is exactly what separates good writers from great ones. As So Young sat down, she missed the way several of her classmates exchanged meaningful glances. The connection between their young professor and the quiet literature student hadn't gone unnoticed by everyone in the class, though both Ji-hoon and So Young remained blissfully unaware of how transparent their mutual fascination had become. After class, as students filed out in their usual rush to escape to lunch or their next lecture, So Young lingered, pretending to organize her notes while stealing glances at Professor Park. He was gathering his materials with characteristic precision, but she noticed the way he moved more slowly than usual, as if he too was reluctant for this hour to end. "Miss Han," he called as she finally stood to leave, "could you stay for a moment? I'd like to discuss your latest essay." So Young's heart performed Olympic-level gymnastics in her chest. Her essay on the influence of traditional Korean poetry on contemporary fiction had been something she'd poured her heart into, staying up until 3 in the morning to perfect every sentence. "Of course, Professor," she said, approaching his desk with careful steps. Ji-hoon waited until the last student had left, and the door had clicked shut behind them before speaking. The lecture hall, so full of energy and voices just moments before, now felt intimate and charged with possibility. "Your essay," he began, pulling it from his stack of papers, "was exceptional. But more than that, it was personal. You write about literature not as an academic subject, but as something that lives and breathes inside you. So," Young felt heat rise in her cheeks. Is that inappropriate for an academic paper?" "No," Ji-hoon said quickly. Perhaps too quickly. "No, it's exactly what good writing should be. It's what I try to teach all my students, but so few of them understand. You have a gift, So Young. Your perspective, your voice. It's unique." The use of her first name sent a shiver through her that she tried desperately to hide. In 3 months, he had never called her anything but Miss Han, maintaining the professional distance that was expected between professor and student. "I've been thinking," Ji-hoon continued, seemingly unaware of the slip, "about offering you an independent study opportunity. There's a research project I'm working on about the intersection of classical and modern Korean literature. I could use a research assistant with your insights." So, Young stared at him, wondering if she'd somehow fallen asleep during his lecture, and was now dreaming this conversation. "You want me to work with you on your research?" "Only if you're interested," Ji-hoon said, and she caught something vulnerable in his voice, as if her answer mattered more than it should. "It would mean spending additional time together, working closely on analysis and writing. I know you're busy with your other courses." "Yes," So Young said before he could finish the sentence. "Yes, I would love that opportunity." The smile that spread across Ji-hoon's face was unlike any expression she'd seen from him in the classroom. Less controlled, more genuine, reaching. His eyes in a way that made her stomach flutter with butterflies she had no business feeling for her professor. What neither of them knew was that this decision would change everything. The independent study sessions began the following week in Ji-hoon's office, a cramped but cozy space lined floor to ceiling with books in Korean, English, and Japanese. The walls were covered with literary quotes written in his precise handwriting, and his desk was organized chaos, stacks of student papers mixed with his own manuscript pages, coffee-stained notebooks, and a small succulent plant that somehow thrived despite the lack of natural light. So Young arrived for their first session with nervous energy coursing through her veins. She'd changed clothes 3 times that morning, settling finally on a simple white blouse and navy skirt that she hoped struck the right balance between professional and pretty. "Come in," Ji-hoon called when she knocked, and she found him surrounded by what appeared to be every book ever written about Korean poetry. "I may have gotten a bit carried away with the research materials." So Young laughed, and the sound seemed to fill the small space with warmth. "It looks like you're building a fort out of books." "That's not a terrible idea," Ji-hoon said, grinning. "We could hide in here and emerge only when we've solved all the mysteries of Korean literature." It was a moment of levity that broke some of the tension between them. But it also created a different kind of awareness. The realization that Professor Park, outside the formal setting of the lecture hall, was funny and charming and devastatingly handsome when he smiled. They settled into work, spreading books and papers across every available surface. The research project focused on how traditional Seijo poetry influenced contemporary Korean novels, and So Young threw herself into the analysis with passionate intensity. "Look at this," she said after an hour of reading, pointing to a passage in a modern novel. The author is using the same emotional progression as a classical Seijo: introduction of a scene, development of emotion, and then this twist that recontextualizes everything that came before. Ji-hoon leaned closer to see what she was indicating, and suddenly they were sharing the same breathing space, their faces inches apart as they bent over the book. So Young could smell his cologne, something subtle and woody that made her want to close her eyes and memorize the scent. "You're absolutely right," he said, his voice lower than usual. I hadn't noticed that parallel before. When he looked up at her, So Young found herself trapped in his gaze, seeing flecks of gold in his brown eyes that she'd never noticed from her seat in the lecture hall. For a moment, the academic pretense fell away entirely, and they were simply a man and a woman discovering something electric and dangerous and wonderful in the space between them. Ji-hoon pulled back first, clearing his throat and creating professional distance, even as his heart hammered against his ribs. That's exactly the kind of insight that will make this research groundbreaking. But the moment had been acknowledged, even in their mutual retreat from it, and everything shifted after that. Their weekly sessions became the highlight of both their schedules. Ji-hoon found himself looking forward to Tuesday afternoons with an anticipation that had nothing to do with academic research and everything to do with the way So Young's face lit up when she discovered a new connection between texts, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was thinking, the way she challenged his interpretations with respectful confidence that made him see familiar literature through fresh eyes. So Young, for her part, began to understand that Professor Park, Ji-hoon, as she thought of him now, though she would never dare use his first name aloud, was not the intimidating academic figure she'd imagined. He was passionate about literature, in a way that was infectious, yes, but he was also kind and patient, encouraging her ideas even when they diverged from established academic thinking. He brought her coffee during their long sessions, remembered that she preferred it with extra cream, asked about her other classes and her family with genuine interest that felt more personal than professional. 3 weeks into their independent study, So Young made a discovery that changed everything. She was in the university library, researching additional sources for their project, when she stumbled across a display of new acquisitions. Among the recent additions was a novel she'd never heard of, Midnight in Seoul by P.J. Park. The author photo was small and slightly blurred, but something about it made her look twice. Her blood turned to ice water in her veins. The man in the photo, looking slightly younger and with longer hair, was unmistakably Professor Park Ji-hoon. So Young checked out the book with hands that weren't entirely steady and spent the entire night reading it cover to cover. The novel was beautiful, a love story set against the backdrop of modern Seoul, filled with the kind of poetic language and emotional depth that had made her fall in love with literature in the first place. But it was more than beautiful. It was familiar. The female protagonist was a literature student at a prestigious university. She was quiet and thoughtful, with an intuitive understanding of poetry that impressed her professors. She had shoulder-length hair and a habit of tucking it behind her ear when she was thinking. She preferred her coffee with extra cream. So Young stared at the book in her lap, her heart pounding with a mixture of flattery, confusion, and something that might have been panic. The character wasn't exactly her. The plot was pure fiction, the setting slightly different. But the resemblance was unmistakable. Professor Park had written a character inspired by her. She was his muse. The realization should have been thrilling, but instead it left her feeling exposed and uncertain. What did it mean that her professor had been observing her closely enough to capture not just her appearance, but her mannerisms, her way of thinking, her very essence on the page? What did it mean that he'd written a love story with her as inspiration? And what did it mean that the novel had been published 6 months ago, before she'd even enrolled in his class? The next Tuesday, So Young arrived at their session with the novel hidden in her bag and questions burning in her throat. Ji-hoon was already waiting, surrounded by their usual chaos of books and papers, but she could barely focus on the research spread before them. "You seem distracted today," Ji-hoon observed after 20 minutes of So Young staring at the same page without taking any notes. "Professor Park," she began, then stopped, unsure how to voice what she discovered. "You can call me Ji-hoon when we're working like this," he said gently. "We're colleagues now in a way." The invitation to use his first name might have thrilled her under normal circumstances, but today it only added to her confusion. "Ji-hoon," she said carefully, testing the feel of his name on her tongue. I found something, in the library. She pulled the novel from her bag and placed it on the desk between them. Ji-hoon's face went completely white, then flushed red in a way that would have been endearing if So-young hadn't been so bewildered by the implications of her discovery. So-young, I can explain. You wrote about me, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Before you even knew me, you wrote about someone exactly like me. Ji-hoon ran his hands through his hair, destroying his usually perfect styling. It's not what you think. I mean, it is what you think. But it's also more complicated than that. Then explain it to me, So-young said, her voice stronger now. Because I spent all night reading about a character who drinks her coffee the same way I do, who has the same thoughts about literature that I have, who even looks like me. And this book was published before I was ever your student. Ji-hoon stood up and began pacing the small confines of his office, clearly struggling with how much to reveal. I saw you, he said finally. Last spring, you were in the university cafe. You were reading, I think it was Kim Seoul's poetry, and you had this expression on your face like the words were speaking directly to your soul. I watched you for maybe 10 minutes, completely captivated by how you seemed to be having a conversation with the text. So-young's breath caught. She remembered that day. She'd been struggling with a particularly difficult course and had found solace in poetry, sitting alone in the cafe until late in the evening. I went home that night and couldn't stop thinking about you, Ji-hoon continued, his voice growing more vulnerable with each word. Not in an inappropriate way, just... You represented something I'd been trying to capture in my writing for years. This idea of someone who doesn't just read literature but lives it, breathes it, makes it part of themselves. I wrote the entire first draft in 3 weeks. But you didn't know me, So-young said, still trying to process what she was hearing. I knew enough, Ji-hoon replied. I knew you understood something about the power of words that most people never grasp. I knew you had this quality of attention, this way of being present in a moment that is incredibly rare. I created a character inspired by that one glimpse of you, and then I spent months developing her story. So-young stared at him, seeing her professor in an entirely new light. And when I enrolled in your class, I nearly had a heart attack, Ji-hoon admitted with a laugh that held no humor. There you were, the inspiration for my novel, sitting in my classroom. It felt like the universe was playing some kind of cosmic joke on me. Is that why you ask me so many questions in class? Why you're always looking at me? Ji-hoon's cheeks reddened further. Partly, but mostly it's because your answers consistently surprise and delight me. You think about literature the way I hoped my character would think about it, but you're also completely yourself, more complex and interesting than anything I could have imagined. So-young felt her world tilting on its axis. So I'm your muse. You're my muse, Ji-hoon confirmed quietly. But So-young, you're also my student and I'm your professor, and I know how complicated this makes everything. The weight of the situation settled between them like a physical presence. The attraction that had been building over weeks of close collaboration, the intellectual and emotional connection that had grown deeper with each session, the way they seemed to understand each other on a level that transcended the typical professor-student relationship, all of it suddenly made sense, and all of it was impossible. What happens now? So-young asked, her voice small. Ji-hoon returned to his chair, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. I don't know. I've never been in this situation before. I never expected to meet you, let alone to have you become my student. And I certainly never expected... Expected what? To fall for you, he said simply, the words hanging in the air, between them like a confession and a surrender. So-young felt tears prick at her eyes, tears of relief, confusion, joy, and frustration all mixed together. Ji-hoon, Don't, he said gently. Don't say anything you might regret. This is my fault, my complication. You shouldn't have to deal with the consequences of my inappropriate feelings. What if they're not inappropriate? So-young asked, surprising herself with her boldness. What if I've been falling for you too? Wondering if the way you look at me means what I hope it means. Counting down the hours until our sessions because they're the best part of my week. The silence that followed was deafening. Ji-hoon stared at her as if she was speaking a foreign language, as if the possibility that his feelings might be reciprocated had never occurred to him. So young, he said finally. You're 22 years old. You're my student. I'm in a position of authority over you. Even if we both feel what we feel, acting on it would be wrong. Would it? She challenged. I'm an adult. I'm capable of making my own decisions about my feelings, and this independent study is the only class I'm taking with you. After this semester, you won't be my professor anymore. But I am your professor now, Ji-hoon said firmly, though she could see the war between his ethics and his heart playing out across his face. And I won't compromise your education or my professional integrity, no matter how I feel about you. So Young felt something break inside her chest. Not her heart exactly, but her hope. So that's it? We pretend this conversation never happened and go back to discussing Seijo poetry? That's what we have to do, Ji-hoon said, though his voice lacked conviction. But pretending turned out to be impossible. Their research sessions continued, but the dynamic had shifted irrevocably. Every accidental touch, his hand brushing hers as they reached for the same book, her shoulder pressing against his as they leaned over. A text sent electricity through both of them. The air in his small office felt charged with everything they weren't saying, everything they weren't allowing themselves to feel. So Young threw herself into the research with renewed intensity, as if academic excellence could somehow resolve the emotional complexity of their situation. She stayed late in the library, produced insights that genuinely impressed Ji-hoon, and maintained perfect professionalism during their sessions. But Ji-hoon could see the cost of this restraint in the shadows under her eyes, the way she held herself more carefully, the gradual dimming of the spark that had first captivated him in that university cafe. 3 weeks after their confession, Ji-hoon made a decision that surprised even himself. So Young, he said at the end of what had been their most productive yet most tension-filled session, I want to show you something. He led her out of his office, through the nearly empty literature building, and up a staircase she'd never noticed before. They climbed 3 flights until they reached a door marked Roof Access, Authorized Personnel Only. Are we allowed to be here? So, Young asked, as Ji-hoon produced a key. I have special permission, he said, with the first genuine smile she'd seen from him in weeks. Sometimes I come up here to write when my office feels too confining. The rooftop opened up to reveal Seoul spread out below them in the golden light of early evening. The city stretched endlessly in all directions, millions of lights beginning to twinkle as the sun set behind the mountains. It was breathtaking and romantic and completely inappropriate for a professor to share with his student. Ji-hoon, So Young said, her voice containing a warning. I know, he said. I know this is the opposite of maintaining professional boundaries. But I needed you to see this, to understand something. He walked to the edge of the rooftop, where a small table and chair were set up, clearly his outdoor writing space. This is where I come when I'm stuck, when the words won't flow the way they should. And for the past month, every time I've sat here trying to write, all I can think about is you. So, Young approached slowly, as if he were a wild animal she might startle. I've been trying to write the sequel to Midnight in Seoul, Ji-hoon continued. But I can't figure out what happens next for the characters because I can't figure out what happens next for us. The woman I created based on you has fallen in love with her literature professor, and he's fallen in love with her, and I have no idea how their story ends because I'm living it in real time. The honesty in his voice broke something loose in So Young's chest. What do you want to happen next? Ji-hoon turned to face her fully, and in the golden light of the setting sun, with the city of Seoul spread out below them like a promise, he looked younger and more vulnerable than she'd ever seen him. I want to kiss you, he said simply. I Want to hold your hand and walk through the city and introduce you to people as someone who matters to me. I want to take you to poetry readings and bookshops and all the places that make me think of beautiful words and beautiful thoughts. I want to write stories inspired by the way you laugh, the way you think, the way you make me remember why I fell in love with literature in the first place. So, Young felt tears streaming down her face, tears of frustration and longing and the peculiar pain of loving someone you can't have. But I also want you to finish your education without any complications or ethical shadows hanging over it. Ji-hoon continued. I want you to graduate, knowing that everything you achieved was because of your own brilliance, not because of any inappropriate relationship with a professor. I want to do right by you, even if it means doing wrong by my own heart. And what if I'm willing to wait? So, Young asked quietly. What if I'm willing to finish this semester, graduate, and then see if what we feel is still real when there are no power dynamics between us? Ji-hoon stared at her as if she'd just offered him the moon and the stars. You would do that? You would wait? I would wait, So Young said, stepping closer to him. Because what I feel for you isn't just attraction to my professor. It's not some academic crush or fascination with authority. I'm in love with your mind, your passion for literature, the way you see beauty in words and ideas. I'm in love with your integrity. The fact that you're willing to sacrifice what you want for what you believe is right. I'm in love with you, Ji-hoon, not Professor Park. The distance between them had shrunk to mere inches, and Ji-hoon raised his hand as if to touch her face, then let it fall back to his side. If we're going to wait, he said, his voice rough with emotion, then we have to really wait. No more sessions alone in my office. No more moments like this. We have to maintain professional boundaries until you graduate. So, Young nodded, though. It felt like agreeing to hold her breath for the next 2 months. And after graduation? After graduation, Ji-hoon said, allowing himself to smile. I'm going to ask you on a proper date. I'm going to take you somewhere beautiful and treat you like the remarkable woman you are. Not like my student or my muse, but like someone I'm hoping might want to build something real with me. I'll say yes, So Young whispered. Promise me? I promise. They stood there for a long moment, drinking in each other's faces in the golden light, memorizing this moment when everything changed and nothing changed, when they chose love and chose to wait for it. The last 2 months of the semester were the longest of both their lives. Ji-hoon arranged for So Young to complete her independent study through email correspondence and paper submissions, eliminating the temptation of private meetings. In class, he maintained perfect professorial distance, calling on her no more or less than any other student, though So Young could sometimes catch him looking at her with an expression that made her stomach flutter with anticipation. So Young threw herself into her final projects with the intensity of someone trying to prove herself worthy of the leap of faith they were both taking. She wrote papers that impressed not just Ji-hoon, but her other professors, participated in literature conferences, and began developing her own ideas about pursuing graduate studies. They didn't speak privately, didn't exchange personal messages, didn't allow themselves any moments alone together, but sometimes, after particularly engaging class discussions, their eyes would meet across the lecture hall and they would share a look that contained all their waiting, all their hope, all their careful patience. The night before graduation, So Young couldn't sleep. She stood on the small balcony of her apartment, looking out at the Seoul skyline and thinking about how much her life was about to change. Tomorrow, she would officially cease to be Ji-hoon's student. Tomorrow, the waiting would be over. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Congratulations on your graduation. I'm proud of everything you've accomplished. Jay. She smiled, hugging the phone to her chest, and typed back, "Thank you for waiting with me." His response came immediately. It was worth every minute. Graduation day dawned bright and clear, one of those perfect Seoul spring days when the cherry blossoms were in full bloom and the city seemed to sparkle with possibility. So Young walked across the stage to receive her diploma, and when they called her name, She looked out into the audience and found Ji-hoon's face among the faculty section. He was smiling with such pride and joy that she felt her own face light up in response. After the ceremony, after the photos with family and the congratulations from classmates, So-young found herself standing alone outside the literature building, still wearing her graduation gown and holding her diploma. "Congratulations, graduate," a familiar voice said behind her. She turned to find Ji-hoon approaching, no longer in his academic robes, but wearing a simple button-down shirt and jeans that made him look younger and more approachable than she'd ever seen him. "Thank you, Professor Park," she said formally, then grinned. Thank you, Ji-hoon." "How does it feel?" he asked, stopping a respectful distance away from her. "Like the end of something and the beginning of something else," So-young replied honestly. "And are you ready for the beginning?" So-young looked at him, really looked at him, seeing not her professor, but the man who had been patient enough to wait, ethical enough to do the right thing, even when it was difficult, brave enough to confess his feelings, and wise enough to handle them responsibly. "I'm ready," she said. Ji-hoon's smile could have powered the entire university. "In that case, Miss Han, former Miss Han, would you like to have dinner with me tonight? Somewhere that serves excellent food and doesn't have a single book in sight." So-young laughed, the sound bubbling up from a place of pure joy. "I would love that more than anything." "And tomorrow," Ji-hoon continued, stepping closer, "would you like to help me figure out how the sequel to Midnight in Seoul should end? I have a feeling the female protagonist is about to embark on a beautiful new chapter of her life." "I think," So-young said, closing the distance between them completely, "that she gets her happy ending. The kind that's worth waiting for." "The kind that's worth waiting for," Ji-hoon agreed. And finally, he reached out and took her hand. 6 months later, Ji-hoon published Morning in Seoul, the sequel to his breakthrough novel. The dedication read, "To my muse, my love, my partner in all stories, thank you for teaching me that the best romances are the ones that begin with respect and patience." So-young, now pursuing her master's degree in literature at a different university, kept a copy of the book on her nightstand. Sometimes, when Ji-hoon was working late in his study, she would read passages aloud to him, and they would laugh at how their fictional counterpart's love story had turned out to be so much simpler than their real one. Their real love story was messier and more complicated, full of ethical considerations and careful boundaries, and the kind of mature decision-making that doesn't always make for dramatic fiction. But it was also deeper and more meaningful because of those complications, built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared values that made their connection stronger than mere attraction or academic fascination. Ji-hoon never again had a student who served as his muse, and So-young never again had a professor who saw her as anything other than a scholar. But they had each other, the teacher who had been brave enough to wait and the student who had been wise enough to let him. And every Tuesday afternoon, they still met in Ji-hoon's office to discuss literature and share ideas. But now So-young could call him by his first name, could touch his hand when she wanted to emphasize a point, could kiss him goodbye before heading to her own classes. They had learned that love doesn't always have to be immediate to be real, that waiting can make the heart grow not just fonder, but wiser, and that the most beautiful stories are often the ones where two people choose to do the right thing even when it's difficult. In Seoul, a city of millions of love stories, theirs had become one worth telling, not just because it was romantic, but because it was right.